I arrived at our 10th anniversary dinner 12 minutes late, accompanied by an older stranger in a plain gray suit carrying a neat leather briefcase. Standing under the lights, my husband Grant raised his glass. "Well, look at that. She finally made it. What is this? Babe introducing your boyfriend?" The room laughed. I did not. The stranger set his briefcase on the table, unlatched it, and pulled out a legal file bearing Grant's company name. "My name is Nina Bradshaw. I am 34 years old, and tonight I walked into the most elaborate trap my husband had ever set for me. It was supposed to be the celebration of our 10-year anniversary. Most normal couples might mark a decade of marriage with a quiet dinner, perhaps a secluded weekend trip to the mountains, or even just a shared bottle of wine on the living room floor. Grant Mercer was not a normal husband, and he had absolutely no interest in quiet moments. He chose a sprawling, high-end estate venue situated just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. The location was dripping in aggressive luxury, draped from floor to ceiling in white silk, illuminated by cascading crystal chandeliers, and overflowing with thousands of imported white orchids. He did not rent this venue out of a deep sense of romance or nostalgia. He did it because Grant never missed an opportunity to turn a private milestone into a polished, high-return showcase. The guest list was a calculated spreadsheet of wealthy friends, his socially ambitious family, and most importantly, the key investors and partners of his company, Mercer House Events. He was selling them the image of a perfect, stable, unbreakable partnership. I was merely the prop required to complete the tableau. I stood in the massive arched doorway of the grand ballroom, taking a slow, measured breath. The chandelier light caught the edges of crystal wine glasses on 50 different meticulously arranged tables. The low hum of networking and the soft melodies of a live jazz quartet filled the air. I was exactly 12 minutes late, and I did not come alone. Beside me stood Owen Pike. He was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a muted, charcoal gray suit that was expensive precisely because it drew absolutely no attention to itself. His face was entirely unreadable, carved into a mask of permanent, professional calm. In his right hand, he carried a slim, immaculately constructed leather briefcase. He looked nothing like the kind of man a bitter wife brings to a party to spark rumors. He did not look like a passionate new lover. He looked exactly like what he was, an undertaker for corporate entities. Grant was holding court in the very center of the room, standing under the brightest cluster of lights on a small, elevated stage. He held a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and the rapt attention of 200 guests in the other. He thrived in this exact geometry, positioning himself as the blazing sun while everyone else was forced to orbit his gravity. When he spotted me standing at the entrance with a strange man, his perfectly practiced, photogenic smile widened into a sharp smirk. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The ringing sound cut through the jazz, and the entire room quieted down. Turning toward the doorway, "Well, look at that," Grant announced. His voice was incredibly smooth, projecting easily and confidently across the ballroom. "She finally made it. What is this? Babe introducing your boyfriend?" The room erupted. It was a practiced, synchronized wave of laughter. Exactly the kind of sound wealthy people offer to a charismatic man who signs their checks, plans their exclusive galas, or holds their investments. I did not smile. I did not shift my weight. I did not look down. I just let the cruel, echoing laughter wash over me like cold water. At the premium table closest to the stage, my mother-in-law, Elaine Mercer, laughed the loudest. It was a sharp, brittle sound that carried over the crowd. Beside her sat my sister-in-law, Tessa. Tessa already had her smartphone raised high, the little red recording light glowing brightly. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, fully believing she was about to capture the exact moment the boring, dependable background wife finally cracked and humiliated herself in front of Charlotte's elite society. They all waited for the meltdown. They waited for me to blush furiously, to stammer defensively, to act flustered, to turn around and run out into the night, or perhaps to throw a childish, screaming fit. Instead, I raised my hands and slowly peeled off my evening gloves. Pulling the fabric away one finger at a time, I handed the gloves to a passing wide-eyed waiter. Then, I began to walk forward. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, beating a steady tempo through the dying laughter. Owen followed a half-step behind me, his silence feeling infinitely heavier than the whispers now rippling through the crowded tables. I stopped just a few feet from the edge of Grant's stage. I looked up at him. I looked past the flawlessly tailored tuxedo, past the charming, styled crest of his hair, straight into the shallow depths of a man who firmly believed he owned the entire narrative of my life. "No, Grant," I said. My voice was not loud, but the acoustic design of the room was flawless, and the sudden, breathless, heavy silence of the crowd carried every single syllable to the far corners of the hall. "This is the man you should have met 3 months ago." Grant blinked. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second before he violently forced it back into place. He opened his mouth, likely to deliver another condescending punchline, but Owen moved before he could speak. Owen did not ask for permission. He stepped forward and placed his leather briefcase flat on the nearest dining table, right between a towering centerpiece of white roses and a startled real estate developer. The twin metallic snaps of the briefcase locks echoed through the dead-silent room like the racking of a shotgun. Owen opened the heavy lid. He reached inside and withdrew a thick, neatly bound stack of legal documents. He placed them on the white linen tablecloth, turning them so they faced Grant. The top sheet was a formal notice of financial default. Beneath it lay the irrevocable confirmation of a secured debt transfer. And beneath that rested a comprehensive, devastating legal summary, bearing the bold, embossed logo of Grant's own enterprise, Mercer House Events. At the adjacent tables, the mood of the room shifted violently. A few of Grant's key investors, men who spent their entire lives reading the fine print and sniffing out bad assets, leaned in sharply. They saw the heavy legal stock. They recognized the bold red banking stamps, the notary seals, and the rigid structure of a foreclosure warning. I watched the color rapidly drain from the face of Arthur Vance, the primary financial backer for Mercer House Events. Arthur slowly set his whiskey glass down on the table. He looked from the terrifying papers to Owen, and then finally, up to me. The seasoned businessmen in the room understood the visual vocabulary of ruin immediately. The air in the ballroom grew instantly freezing. They realized in a heartbeat that this was not a theatrical display of marital jealousy. This was a corporate execution. Grant stared down at the papers. For a long, agonizing moment, his brain simply refused to process the typography. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing defensively. He still thought I was playing a desperate, emotional game. He still fundamentally believed he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. He let out a dry, forced chuckle, trying desperately to steer the runaway train back onto his familiar, comfortable tracks. "Nina, sweetheart," Grant said. His tone was dripping with heavy, patronizing concern. He pitched his voice perfectly so the captive audience would hear the immense patience of a long-suffering, benevolent husband dealing with an unstable wife. "I know we have been having some personal issues lately. I know you are feeling neglected because of my work schedule, but staging a little corporate drama at our anniversary dinner, bringing fake papers to scare my guests, this is a bit much, even for you. Let us take this outside and calm down before you do something you regret." He stepped off the stage and reached out to grab my arm. The gesture was designed to look comforting to the onlookers, but the grip was intended to control and silence me. I did not step back. I did not flinch away from his touch. I simply looked down at his hand resting on my arm, staring at it with total detachment until he felt the intense scrutiny of 200 people and awkwardly pulled it away. I surveyed the silent room. I looked at Elaine, whose smug, triumphant expression was rapidly curdling into a pale, tight-lipped confusion. I looked at Tessa, whose smartphone was slowly lowering as the horrific realization dawned on her that she was not live recording my dramatic destruction, but the total financial collapse of her golden brother. Finally, I turned my attention back to my husband. I did not come here to make a scene, Grant, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence of the extravagant ballroom. I came to end a play that has been put on for far too long. 8 months before the night I dismantled my husband's life in front of 200 people. I was just a woman sitting in a sleek, soundproofed office in downtown Charlotte, doing exactly what I did best, calculating the precise probability of a catastrophic failure. People have always underestimated me. I am quiet by nature. I do not raise my voice in board meetings. I do not perform for attention, and I do not demand the spotlight. At 34 years old, I served as the Director of Supplier Risk Management for Alder Row Systems, a massive logistics and infrastructure firm. My daily existence revolved around identifying weak points in complex corporate supply chains before they collapsed. I spent my days reading 50-page vendor contracts, analyzing financial burn rates, and looking for the tiny hidden fractures that could bring a multi-million-dollar operation to its knees. I was paid to be deeply cynical. I was paid to look at a beautifully painted bridge and know exactly which rusted bolt would snap first under pressure. It is the greatest irony of my life that for nearly 10 years, I applied absolutely none of that ruthless professional scrutiny to my own marriage. Grant, on the other hand, existed entirely on the surface. He was the glittering, flawless face of Mercer House events. While I dealt in concrete risks and hard numbers, Grant dealt in smoke, mirrors, and expensive champagne. His agency specialized in corporate galas, elite charity fundraisers, and high-stakes brand launches. He possessed a rare, magnetic kind of charisma that made people instantly want to give him their money. He was the man who remembered the names of every investor's children, the man who knew exactly which vintage of bourbon to send a reluctant client, and the man whose infectious, booming laugh made people feel like they were the absolute center of the universe. In the wealthy social circles of North Carolina, Grant had carefully cultivated the image of a visionary. He lived entirely by the reputation of being the man who could turn a simple handshake into pure gold. In the eyes of the sprawling Mercer family, Grant was a self-made social genius. I, however, was simply the paperwork wife. I was the reliable, invisible mechanism working silently behind the heavy velvet curtains. If a vendor contract had a disastrous typo, I fixed it. If quarterly corporate taxes were due, I ensured they were paid from the correct holding accounts. If a high-maintenance client needed a customized, frantic apology gift because Grant missed a meeting, I handled the logistics so Grant could preserve his effortless charm. The family loved to tell the story of Grant's meteoric rise to the top. At country club brunches and holiday dinners, my mother-in-law, Elaine, would hold court, recounting how Grant built his empire from absolutely nothing. She would claim he was armed with nothing but a brilliant mind and an unmatched work ethic. She would wave a perfectly manicured hand in my direction and add that I was very lucky to have stood by his side at the right time. That was the Mercer family mythology. The truth, however, was buried deep in a locked filing cabinet, printed on bank statements from our second year of marriage. During the first 2 seasons of Mercer House events, the company was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. Grant had overpromised on a massive tech launch and severely underbudgeted his labor costs. He was exactly 3 weeks away from declaring total bankruptcy. I was the one who saved him. I did not just offer emotional support or a shoulder to cry on. I sold my premarital condominium in the city. I liquidated a highly profitable equity stake I held from a small software project I had helped develop in my mid-20s. I poured every single dollar of my own, hard-earned independence into Grant's failing business to cover payroll, settle angry vendor debts, and keep the lights on. I bought him the financial runway he desperately needed to finally secure his first major, profitable client. I never asked for a grand public acknowledgement. I loved him, and I genuinely believed we were building a fortified life together. But as the years passed, my massive financial sacrifice was quietly erased from the family records. It was smoothed over and aggressively rewritten until my capital investment became nothing more than wifely encouragement. Elaine perfected the dark art of the backhanded compliment. She treated me with a suffocating, polite coldness. She would introduce me to her wealthy friends by patting my arm and saying, "This is Nina. She is our steady one." It sounded like gentle praise, but I knew exactly what it meant. Steady meant boring. Steady meant I was the one expected to endure. It framed me permanently as the dutiful, uncomplaining anchor whose sole purpose was to keep her brilliant, soaring sun tethered to reality. Tessa, Grant's younger sister, was equally dismissive. Tessa ran the social media division for Mercer House Events, which essentially meant she took perfectly filtered photographs of herself holding clipboards at Grant's expensive parties. She viewed my wardrobe and my calm demeanor as a personal affront to the company's luxurious aesthetic. She would look at my tailored navy suits and neutral silk blouses with an expression of mild, theatrical pity. "You should really wear brighter colors, Nina," she told me once, right before a major charity gala. "You need to look a little more like a founder's wife. You know, less like you are about to audit the coat check." I ignored them. I swallowed the insults. I told myself their shallow opinions did not matter as long as Grant and I were equal partners in our home. But slowly, imperceptibly over the last 2 years, Grant began to view me exactly the same way his family did. I became a piece of high-end furniture in the sprawling architecture of his life. I was reliable. I was highly functional. I kept his foundation rock solid. But you do not applaud a load-bearing wall. You just expect it to hold up the heavy roof while you admire the expensive paintings hung upon it. Grant stopped discussing the business with me as a partner and started treating me like a senior employee. He no longer felt the need to respect me in front of an audience. His jokes at my expense grew slightly sharper, and his casual dismissals in front of his staff became slightly more frequent. The absolute breaking point, the exact moment the final rusted bolt snapped, arrived on a Tuesday evening in our kitchen. We were drinking coffee, and I brought up our upcoming 10-year anniversary. I suggested we rent a secluded cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, just the two of us, for 3 quiet days, no cell service, no clients, no caterers, and no family. Grant leaned back against the cold marble counter, swirling his coffee, and gave me a look of deep, patronizing amusement. "Nina, we cannot just disappear into the woods," he said, laughing softly as if I had suggested something utterly childish and absurd. 10 years is a milestone. It is a narrative. I've already spoken to the venue coordinators. We are going to do a massive dinner. The guest list is already over 150 people. Arthur Vance and the rest of the investment board will be there. I stared at him, my coffee rapidly cooling in my hands. "You want to invite investors to our wedding anniversary? It is not just an anniversary, babe," he replied, entirely missing the freezing coldness spreading through my chest. "It is a statement of stability. It shows the financial backers that we are a rock-solid unit, a unified front. It is good for the family brand. You do not have to worry about a single thing. I will have the event team handle all the boring details. You just need to show up. Wear that incredible silver dress I bought you last year, and smile for the cameras." He walked over, kissed the top of my head dismissively, and left the kitchen to take a phone call from a vendor. He did not ask if I was okay with the plan. He simply issued a corporate directive. I sat alone in the quiet kitchen for a very long time. I listened to his booming laugh echoing from the hallway. I realized then that I was no longer a wife to Grant Mercer. I was a prop. I was a necessary visual aid designed to keep his investors feeling secure. And as the director of supplier risk management, I finally did what I was trained to do. I opened my laptop, completely numb but entirely awake, and began to quietly audit the man I married. The shift in my husband did not manifest as a sudden, dramatic fading of romance. There were no tearful arguments in the middle of the night, no sudden coldness in our daily routine. Instead, he behaved exactly like a man who was meticulously preparing to transition into a completely new life while desperately ensuring his current assets remained perfectly intact until he was ready to leave. He was unusually agreeable. He was aggressively pleasant. It was the terrifying calm of a thief slowly backing out of a room. I began my search exactly where all my professional investigations begin in the ledger. because I still held legacy administrative access to the primary corporate accounts from the years I ran his back office. I decided to take a quiet, thorough look at the operating expenses. What I found was a chaotic scattering of anomalies. There was a short-term lease agreement for a luxury apartment in uptown Charlotte, costing exactly $5,200 a month. There were recurring weekly charges for premium fresh floral arrangements delivered every Friday afternoon. I found invoices for private black car services booked exclusively on weekends, alongside sudden, urgent commercial flights to cities like Miami and Denver that had absolutely zero correlation to any event Mercer House was currently producing. When I casually brought up the unusual cash flow during breakfast one morning, Grant barely looked up from his tablet. He swallowed a bite of toast and waved his hand dismissively. "Client hospitality, babe," he said smoothly, his voice devoid of any hesitation. "You know how these high-net-worth individuals operate. We have to wine and dine them, keep them comfortable. It is the cost of doing business at this level." I nodded slowly and poured myself more coffee. I did not push the issue. I did not scream. But I was a risk manager. I spent 40 hours a week analyzing corporate spending structures to detect fraud and operational bloat. I knew exactly what an aggressive client acquisition budget looked like, and I knew what a hidden parallel domestic life looked like. You do not buy a client an expensive apartment lease for 3 months. You do not send anonymous orchids every Friday to a business partner. The phantom expenses took on a very physical shape 2 weeks later at a boutique fragrance brand launch hosted by Mercer House. I was standing near the back of the venue, nursing a glass of sparkling water. When I saw them, Grant was standing by a towering floral installation, talking to Brooke Halden. Brooke was a local social media influencer who had recently been put on the company payroll under the vague, unquantifiable title of image consultant. I had never paid much attention to her before, assuming she was just another attractive contractor hired to make the company look modern online. But as I watched them interact from across the room, the invisible gravity between them was undeniable. They were standing merely 2 inches apart, completely violating the standard professional distance. More alarming than their physical proximity was her total command of his environment. Brooke did not behave like an outside contractor attending a client event. She behaved like the host. I watched her snap her fingers to discreetly redirect a lost catering waiter to the VIP section. A moment later, she intercepted a bartender, took a lowball glass from his tray, and handed it directly to Grant without asking what he wanted. I knew exactly what was in that glass. It was a very specific 20-year-old reserve bourbon served with a single, oversized ice cube. It was his absolute favorite drink, something he rarely ordered in public unless he was extremely comfortable. I walked over to them. Grant stiffened slightly as I approached, his effortless smile freezing into something rigid. Brooke, however, did not flinch. She turned to face me, her perfectly manicured hand resting casually on the edge of the high cocktail table. Her eyes swept over my tailored, conservative dress, taking a silent, immediate inventory of my worth. "You must be the wife," Brooke said. Her voice was bright, coated in a layer of artificial sweetness that failed to mask the deep, underlying condescension. She took a sip of her own drink and smiled right into my eyes. "I have heard so much about you." It was a seemingly polite, completely standard phrase, but the delivery was a territorial marking. It was her way of letting me know she had inside access to the private complaints and the late-night venting of my husband. She knew the narrative Grant was spinning about me. I smiled back, a completely dead professional expression. "It is always fascinating to meet the consultants," I replied, my tone flat and entirely unbothered. I left them standing there and walked out of the venue. The emotional betrayal was sickening, but the true terror arrived 48 hours later in the form of a digital footprint. I was auditing a shared cloud folder, digging deeper into the structural integrity of Grant's enterprise, when I opened a folder labeled with the current fiscal year. Inside was a finalized credit addendum. It was a formal request to a major commercial bank, asking to extend the company's revolving line of credit by an additional $750,000. I scrolled to the very last page of the dense legal document. There, sitting quietly above the guarantor line, was my electronic signature. My blood ran completely cold. I had never seen this document. I had never authorized the use of my digital signature for new credit facilities. I printed the page, folded it neatly, and drove straight to Grant's office. I walked in and placed the folded paper squarely on his mahogany desk. I pointed to the bottom line. "Explain this to me," I demanded. Keeping my voice low and dangerously steady, Grant looked at the paper. For a fleeting second, genuine panic flashed in his eyes, but he suppressed it instantly. His defense mechanism was a rapid, dizzying shift in tone. First, he tried the loving, placating approach. "Oh, sweetheart," he sighed, standing up and reaching for my hands. "Do not worry yourself with this. It is just back-end financial housekeeping." I pulled my hands away sharply. "That is my signature on a massive debt extension I never read. That is fraud." The loving husband vanished, instantly replaced by the annoyed, put-upon executive. His jaw tightened, and his voice dropped into a harsh, scolding register. "It was a procedural mistake," he snapped, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "The chief financial officer must have attached the wrong digital authorization token when he sent the packet to the lawyers. I will have them draft a correction next week. God, you do not have to turn every minor clerical error into a federal investigation. You are suffocating me with this constant suspicion." He turned his back on me, effectively ending the conversation. I did not argue. I did not demand the immediate correction. I simply picked up the piece of paper and walked out, knowing with absolute certainty he would never fix it. The final, devastating puzzle piece arrived via certified mail 4 days later. It was a thick, heavy envelope from a prominent corporate law firm representing one of our oldest lighting vendors. I signed for it on the front porch, my heart hammering against my ribs. I sat at the kitchen island and tore it open. It was a formal intent to sue. The vendor was demanding immediate payment for an invoice that was 120 days past due. The total amount owed was $95,000, but the overdue balance was not the problem. The true horror lay in the third paragraph of the legal threat. The lighting company was not just threatening to sue Mercer House Events. They were threatening to sue me directly. Attached to the letter was a copy of the revised vendor agreement Grant had signed 6 months prior. Underneath the corporate liability section, he had quietly inserted a personal guarantor clause. My name, my personal social security number, and my prior home address were neatly typed into the contract. I sat in the completely silent house, staring at the stark black ink. The crushing weight of the reality finally settled over me. Grant was not just sleeping with a younger, flashier woman. He was not just spending company money on luxury apartments and expensive bourbon. He knew his company was heavily leveraged and spiraling toward failure. He was systematically structuring the impending collapse so that when the entire empire finally burned to the ground, I would be legally bound to the wreckage. He was building a financial bomb, and he had spent the last 6 months tying the detonator directly to my neck. I did not scream. I did not throw the vendor lawsuit onto the marble kitchen island or demand a tearful confession. The instinct to confront a betrayer is overwhelmingly human, but it is almost always a catastrophic tactical error. My former boss, Marla Hensley, had drilled that exact lesson into my head during my first year in corporate risk management. She was a brilliant, ruthless woman who had survived 3 corporate mergers and 2 vicious divorces without losing a single cent. Never walk into a battle where the opponent has already set the stage. She used to tell me over bitter black coffee. If they built the theater, they control the lighting. Burn the theater down from the outside instead. Grant had spent months quietly building his stage. He had positioned himself as the overworked, brilliant entrepreneur and framed me as the difficult, ungrateful wife. If I confronted him now with a handful of mismatched papers, he would gaslight me, lock me out of the corporate servers, and accelerate his timeline to destroy my credit. So, instead of shouting, I went completely cold. I took an extended lunch break on a Tuesday afternoon and drove straight to Marla's private consulting firm on the other side of the city. Marla listened to my brief, entirely emotionless summary of the forged credit addendum and the phantom expenses. She did not offer useless pity or sympathetic hugs. She offered a thick business card. That very same afternoon, she personally introduced me to Owen Pike. Owen was a corporate restructuring expert and a forensic accountant of terrifying efficiency. He was a man in his late 50s who spoke with incredible economy, never using 3 words when one would suffice. But he possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to read a corporate ledger the way a trauma surgeon reads an X-ray. He did not care about the broken wedding vows or the emotional betrayal. He only cared about the bleeding numbers. I brought him a single, heavily encrypted flash drive containing the preliminary files I had managed to pull from our home network. We sat in a sterile, windowless conference room in his downtown office. Owen scrolled through the data for exactly 45 minutes in absolute, unbroken silence. The only sound in the room was the steady clicking of his mouse. When he finally closed his laptop, he steepled his fingers and looked at me. "You have 3 distinct layers of acute danger here," Owen said, his voice flat and purely clinical. "First, the company debt structure is completely out of control. Second, your legal identity and digital signatures are being actively abused to secure that toxic debt. Third, the company cash flow is bleeding out at a massive rate to sustain something that has absolutely nothing to do with corporate operations." I nodded. "Tell me exactly what you need to prove it." Over the next 14 days, I became a ghost haunting my own marriage. While Grant was out networking, playing the charismatic founder at expensive lunches, and presumably entertaining Brooke, I was systematically ripping his digital life down to the bare studs. I abandoned any illusion of privacy. I collected every bank statement I could find, photographing them with a burner phone. I recovered archived, deleted emails from the backup server on our home network while Grant slept soundly beside me. I pulled board meeting minutes, executed vendor contracts, and most importantly, I downloaded hundreds of PDF files just to extract the hidden metadata. Metadata does not lie. It shows exactly who created a document, who modified it, and at what exact minute the changes were saved. I even mirrored the shared company calendar that Grant always assumed I would find far too boring to ever monitor. I gathered it all, packaged it securely, and fed it directly into Owen's secure server. What Owen uncovered with that raw data was a masterclass in financial desperation and staggering arrogance. Mercer House Events was not the thriving, industry-leading empire Grant pretended it was. It was a crumbling house of cards, held together by the most aggressive, predatory lending I had ever seen. Grant had been leveraging future, unexecuted event contracts to secure short-term, incredibly high-interest loans. It was essentially corporate payday lending. The terms were absolutely brutal. If he missed even a handful of scheduled payment milestones, the lenders had the legal right to instantly seize control of the company assets and liquidate everything. But the most sickening twist was the actual destination of the largest loan on the books. For months, Grant had boasted loudly to his family, his friends, and his investors about securing a massive injection of capital to fund a nationwide expansion. That was a complete and total fabrication. The money never went to opening new markets. Owen traced the funds directly into a massive, hidden sinkhole. The capital was used to secretly plug the devastating financial losses of 2 disastrous corporate retreats Grant had severely mismanaged the previous year. What was left of the loan after covering those massive losses was being burned at an astonishing rate to maintain his artificial illusion of extreme wealth. The borrowed money was paying for the luxury apartment lease, the private black car services, the extravagant dinners, and the carefully crafted image he presented to his mother, his investors, and his mistress. He was literally setting fire to our future just to keep his shadow on the wall looking large. Speaking of the mistress, the meticulous ledger revealed the exact, infuriating nature of Brooke Halden. She was not just a romantic affair hidden in the shadows. I found her submitted invoices. Brooke was being paid $12,500 every single month, directly from the corporate operating account. Her billing code was vaguely listed as Brand Advisory Services. But Owen and I scoured the internal network, the project management software, and the communication channels. We found absolutely zero tangible deliverables. There were no marketing reports, no strategy decks, no executed social media campaigns, and no consultation summaries. She was literally submitting blank invoices with a dollar amount, and Grant was approving them the same day. She was a phantom employee, draining the company dry to fund her lifestyle while smiling directly into my face at public events. The investigation was airtight, but the final hammer drop came on a rainy Thursday morning. We were sitting in Owen's office when he delivered the fatal piece of the puzzle. He pushed a freshly printed amortization schedule across the massive oak desk toward me. The primary short-term loan is approaching a critical balloon payment in exactly 3 weeks, Owen explained, tapping the paper with a silver pen. The company simply does not have the liquidity to cover it. The lenders will undoubtedly call the debt early, which will immediately trigger a total, catastrophic default. To prevent that from happening, your husband is going to have to restructure the entire debt facility into a new, consolidated package. He paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the killing blow. And to do that, considering his currently horrific debt-to-income ratio and the damaged state of the company collateral, he's going to need a brand new, physically witnessed signature from his primary guarantor. Owen looked me dead in the eye. He is going to need you to sign a new paper, Nina, and he is going to need it very soon. I sat perfectly still, staring at the calendar sitting on the corner of Owen's desk, the dates aligned with terrifying, chilling precision. In exactly 3 weeks, Grant and I were scheduled to host our massive 10-year anniversary gala, the extravagant party with 150 carefully selected guests, the powerful investors, the ambitious family, the perfectly curated audience. It hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. My husband had not planned an anniversary party. The flowers, the venue, the jazz band, the expensive dress he bought me were not a celebration of our marriage. None of it was a gift. And it certainly was not a genuine statement of stability to his backers. It was an ambush. It was a beautiful, expensive velvet-lined box designed specifically to hide a very sharp knife. Grant intended to corner me in a room full of powerful people, surround me with immense social pressure, and present a stack of papers disguised as some romantic gesture or standard household agreement. He was going to use the audience to force my hand. Knowing I despised making public scenes, he was planning to force me to sign away the rest of my financial life to save his failing empire. He thought I was completely blind. He thought I was just the steady, boring wife who would smile for the cameras and sign whatever was placed in front of her. He was profoundly wrong. I did not cry. I simply looked at Owen, my mind already building the architecture of my counterstrike, and told him exactly what we were going to do next. Owen and I did not just build a defensive wall. We built a guillotine. The blueprint we drafted in his office that rainy afternoon was brutally simple, yet it required an absolute, flawless execution. We broke the strategy down into 3 distinct phases. Step 1 involved shielding every single asset I had legally brought into the marriage. Step 2 required surgically isolating the toxic financial liabilities Grant was desperately trying to graft onto my identity. Step 3 was the kill shot. We were going to seize total, unassailable control of his actual weakness. Before I even met my husband, I had successfully launched and sold a small software venture. The profits from that sale were parked securely in a private limited liability company called Bradshaw Reed Holdings. Grant knew the entity existed, but he possessed an extreme aversion to technical financial details. He never bothered to understand its corporate structure, nor did he realize that it remained entirely classified as my separate, premarital property under strict state law. He was always far too focused on the money he was actively spending to care about the money I was quietly saving. We targeted the primary secured lender currently holding the largest, most aggressive note on Mercer House events. It was a mid-tier commercial credit firm operating out of Atlanta, and they were currently sweating over Grant and his rapidly deteriorating financial statements. They desperately wanted out. They were staring down the barrel of a messy, protracted bankruptcy court battle, and institutional lenders fundamentally despise unpredictable risks. Through Owen acting as a completely blind intermediary, Bradshaw Reed Holdings approached the credit firm with a quiet, off-market proposition. We offered to buy the entire debt portfolio of Mercer House Events in straight cash. The bank executives were suspicious at first, but Owen was a master of corporate poker. My client specializes in distressed asset recovery. Owen told the lead banker during a conference call I listened to on mute. We believe the underlying event contracts hold potential value. Provided the current, highly ineffective management is eventually replaced, we are willing to take the operational risk off your hands today, but we require a heavy premium for the trouble, because the lender had zero faith left in my husband to manage his own cash flow. They leaped at the clean exit strategy. We negotiated a steep, punishing discount. I purchased the distressed debt for 60 cents on the dollar. Owen structured the entire acquisition through multiple, ironclad legal layers and proxy signatures. If anyone bothered to look at the new municipal filings, the secured creditor was simply listed as an aggressive, faceless holding corporation. My identity was completely buried under stacks of non-disclosure agreements. Over the course of 5 business days, the invisible power dynamic of my entire marriage completely inverted. Grant strutted around our home, firmly believing he was still holding the leash. He did not realize I now legally owned the ground he was standing on. While Owen finalized the commercial paper, I meticulously dismantled the domestic infrastructure of our shared life. I took a half-day off from work and opened a new, highly secure checking account at a completely different banking institution, quietly redirecting my corporate salary deposits. I hired a private wealth attorney to rewrite my estate planning, cleanly severing Grant as a beneficiary to my life insurance and retirement funds. I revoked all his emergency access privileges to my medical records and personal tax portals. Finally, I sat in a sleek glass-walled office with a ruthless family law attorney and drafted a comprehensive divorce petition. I reviewed every single page, signed the bottom with a steady hand, and told her to lock it in her top drawer. I was not ready to file it. Not yet. Back at the house, the atmosphere began to shift dramatically. The Mercer family operated entirely on dramatic friction. They thrived on high-stress conflict because it allowed them to continuously play the victims or the magnanimous saviors. When I deliberately stopped arguing, it completely destroyed their fragile ecosystem. I stopped asking Grant what time he would be home from the office. I stopped reminding him about upcoming quarterly tax deadlines. If he canceled our weekend dinner plans at the last minute to allegedly work late on a pitch, I did not sigh or slam cabinets. I simply smiled, wished him a highly productive evening, and went up to bed early with a book. I did not cry. I did not demand his divided attention. I gave him absolute, terrifying, frictionless peace. It drove them insane. Elaine would call on Sunday afternoons, casting her line into the water, desperately fishing for complaints. She expected me to sound tired, overwhelmed, or mildly hysterical about Grant working so hard. "You really must be losing your mind in that big house all by yourself. Darling," Elaine crooned during one particular phone call. "Grant is just so dedicated to his vision." "I hope you're not making him feel guilty for providing for you." "Not at all, Elaine," I replied, keeping my voice bright and perfectly measured. "I think it is wonderful that he is spending his time exactly how he wants to. I am doing the exact same thing." She paused, audibly unnerved by my total lack of emotion. My silence was a polished mirror they did not want to look into. Then, they made the exact, catastrophic mistake I was hoping for. Tessa was walking out of a boutique fitness studio in the downtown district when she happened to look across the busy street. She saw me sitting at a secluded corner table inside a high-end, dimly lit coffee shop. Sitting directly across from me was Owen Pike. We were intensely reviewing a stack of heavily redacted financial disclosures. But to an uneducated outsider, the optics were entirely different. It looked deeply intimate. We were leaning in close over the table, speaking in hushed, serious tones so the neighboring tables could not hear us discussing interest rates and default clauses. 3 days later, Tessa spotted us together again. This time, we were leaving a commercial title office. As we stepped out onto the sidewalk, Owen placed a polite, purely professional hand on my lower back to guide me through the heavy glass doors. That was all the evidence Tessa needed to construct her fantasy. She immediately ran back to Elaine, breathless and vibrating with the scandalous news that the boring, steady wife was finally stepping out of line. They eagerly deduced that I was having a secret, passionate affair with a wealthy, older gentleman. When the rumor inevitably reached Grant, his reaction was painfully predictable. He was initially furious, his ego bruised by the thought of being replaced. But beneath the wounded male pride, there blossomed a profound sense of malicious, arrogant glee. He firmly believed he finally had the ultimate weapon to use against me. In his twisted moral calculus, a hypothetical infidelity on my part would completely neutralize his own massive, ongoing indiscretions with Brooke. It would publicly validate every terrible, patronizing thing he had ever said about me to his investors and his family. More importantly, he believed it gave him the absolute leverage he needed for the upcoming anniversary party. He assumed that if I dared to cause a scene about the forged loan documents or the failing business, he could simply threaten to expose my fake affair and destroy my reputation in our elite social circles. He thought he held a royal flush. I knew exactly what they were whispering about behind my back. I noticed the smug, knowing looks Tessa shot me across the table during family dinners. I heard the thinly veiled, sarcastic comments Grant would make about my new wardrobe choices and my frequent, unexplained afternoon appointments. "You are certainly dressing up a lot lately just to go run errands," Grant sneered one evening, watching me apply lipstick in the hallway mirror. "Anyone special you are trying to impress? Just making an effort to look the part of a supportive partner," I replied softly, meeting his gaze in the reflection without blinking. I never corrected them. I let them spin their little webs and build their elaborate, false narratives. I actively leaned into the fiction. If I bought an expensive new perfume, I made sure Grant saw the luxury receipt sitting on the kitchen counter. If I came home 2 hours late on a Friday, I offered no explanation whatsoever, simply pouring a glass of wine and ignoring his pointed stares. I realized then that sometimes the absolute cheapest and most devastatingly effective trap you can ever build is simply allowing your opponent to completely misunderstand the game you are playing. They were busy preparing for a messy, emotional divorce scandal based on a fabricated romance. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a corporate slaughterhouse. In the final 2 weeks leading up to the gala, Grant transformed our shared home into a bizarre theater of the absurd. He operated with the sickeningly sweet, over-attentive energy of a man who firmly believed he was successfully pulling off the greatest con of his life. He cornered me in the grand hallway one evening after work, holding 2 crystal glasses of expensive Cabernet, and delivered a spontaneous speech so dripping with manufactured sincerity that it took every ounce of my professional discipline not to laugh directly in his face. "This night is really about us, Nina," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave to that serious, intimate register he usually reserved for closing 6-figure brand deals. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear, a gesture he had probably practiced in his office mirror. "It is a night to reconnect. I know work has been crazy, but I want this to be a beautiful reminder of why we started this journey 10 years ago. Just you and me, celebrating our foundation. It was a phenomenal performance. It would have been entirely convincing if I had not already reviewed the finalized catering manifest he had saved on the shared home network. His intimate night of marital reconnection included confirmed seating arrangements for 212 guests. The list was a heavily curated spreadsheet of regional capital. It was stacked with his commercial landlords, venture capitalists, high-profile vendors, and an entire table dedicated exclusively to local social media influencers. And of course, seated at table 4, perfectly positioned within the primary camera angles of the main stage, was Brooke Halden. The women in his life were equally busy ensuring the physical stage was set exactly to his liking. My mother-in-law, Elaine, arrived at our house completely unannounced on a Tuesday morning, carrying an enormous opaque garment bag from an ultra-luxury boutique downtown. She unzipped it with a flourish to reveal a floor-length, cream gold silk gown. It was undeniably expensive, but it was incredibly conservative, featuring a high, restrictive neckline and long, heavy sleeves. It looked less like an elegant evening gown and more like an elevated, highly restrictive uniform. "I took the absolute liberty of pulling this for you, darling," Elaine announced, draping the heavy fabric over the back of my velvet sofa. "You always tend to dress so severely, so businesslike. We really need you looking soft tonight, approachable and yielding. You need to seamlessly fit the role of the gracious hostess. Grant is under so much pressure to present a unified family front to Arthur Vance and the board, and this color is just so soothing. It says you are supportive." I touched the cold, heavy silk. It was the exact color of total surrender. "It is very thoughtful of you, Elaine," I replied evenly, keeping my facial expression completely blank. "I will make sure it fits the occasion perfectly." The sheer audacity of their production design reached its absolute zenith 3 days later when I intercepted an internal corporate email thread between Grant and his lead event coordinators. They had completely scripted the evening down to the minute. After the main course of dry-aged steak was cleared, Grant was scheduled to give a sprawling 15-minute toast under a single amber spotlight. Following his speech, he had arranged for a live, intimate mini-interview on the main stage to discuss the beautiful intersection of deep love and modern entrepreneurship. The person officially hired and scheduled to conduct this heartwarming interview about our marital success was none other than Brooke. My husband was literally utilizing company funds to pay his mistress to sit on a stage and ask him how he managed to be such a wonderful, dedicated family man. It was a level of disrespect so profound it bordered on genuine psychological illness. But the interview was merely the appetizer for the crowd. The main course was buried in a separate, highly confidential email chain forwarded directly to his outside legal counsel. According to the heavily guarded run of show, right at the emotional climax of the interview, Grant planned to invite me up onto the stage. Surrounded by the swelling music of a live string quartet and the adoring applause of his investors, he was going to present me with a decorative, custom-tooled leather folio. He was pitching it to the event planners as a romantic, symbolic renewal of our joint partnership. He called it a family consensus agreement. I immediately forwarded the attached PDF file to Owen. It took the forensic accountant less than 10 minutes to translate the romantic garbage into terrifying financial reality. "It is a highly sophisticated trap," Owen confirmed over our secure phone line, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The document inside that decorative folio is a blanket spousal consent form, wrapped in incredibly dense corporate jargon. It is the exact legal authorization he desperately needs to bypass the standard underwriting process for the new debt consolidation package. If you sign that paper in front of those witnesses, you are legally binding yourself to the entire toxic restructuring plan. You will be completely on the hook for millions of dollars that he has already spent." Grant was banking entirely on my profound, well-documented hatred of public spectacle. He knew I was naturally introverted. He knew I despised conflict, especially in front of an audience. He calculated that if he ambushed me with a gold-plated pen in front of 200 wealthy peers, his overbearing mother, and his major investors, I would simply smile, take the pen, and sign my financial life away just to avoid ruining the luxurious party. He honestly believed that systemic financial fraud and absolute marital betrayal could be seamlessly covered up by a few sweeping violin chords and some expensive champagne. Meanwhile, Brooke was already practically redecorating my life. I accessed the security cameras at the venue during their final walkthroughs and watched her barking sharp orders at the lighting technicians. She acted exactly like the future queen of the Mercer Empire, casually dismissing seasoned vendors and rearranging floral centerpieces. She clearly believed the exact narrative Grant had sold her. In her mind, I was the obsolete, difficult, boring first wife who was either going to meekly sign the papers and fade away into obscurity, or throw a massive, hysterical, emotional tantrum at the gala and prove to everyone that I was the crazy villain of the story. She was eagerly waiting for me to crack under the pressure. What neither of them knew was that I had already found the ultimate smoking gun regarding his exit strategy. While Grant was standing in his home office, loudly rehearsing his beautiful, sweeping speech about trust, unbreakable loyalty, and building both a home and an empire together, I was reading a commercial lease agreement he had signed just 3 days prior. It was a 1-year lease for a stunning, glass-walled luxury penthouse in the city center. The massive security deposit and the first 3 months of rent were completely paid for by the Mercer House Events operating account. The official move-in date on the penthouse lease was exactly 1 week after our 10-year anniversary party. That single document was the final, defining truth of my entire marriage. Grant was not trying to save our relationship with this extravagant gala. He was not trying to buy us more time to fix his mistakes or mend our broken trust. The entire evening was nothing more than an elaborate corporate heist. He wanted to extract the final, crucial signature he needed to keep his failing company afloat, secure the fresh investor capital, preserve his immaculate social standing for the cameras, and then simply pack his custom suits and move into his new luxury life 7 days later. He intended to leave me entirely crushed under the unbearable, inescapable weight of his massive corporate debt. When I read that date on the lease, sitting alone in the dark glow of my computer monitor, a strange, profound sense of absolute peace washed over me. Any lingering, microscopic fragment of guilt I might have felt about what I was preparing to do evaporated instantly into the cold air. I could have easily sent a legal proxy to the venue. I could have hired a professional process server to walk into that beautiful ballroom, hand him the heavy stack of divorce papers, and walk right back out. I could have stayed home, locked the heavy front doors, poured a glass of wine, and let his angry investors figure out his insolvency on their own time. But running away would have allowed Grant to control the aftermath. If I did not show up, he would have stood on that stage under the amber lights, looked incredibly sad and handsome, and spun a brilliant, tragic story to the crowd about his unstable, unsupportive wife abandoning him on their most special night. He would have weaponized my absence to make himself the ultimate martyr. I absolutely refused to give him the narrative. I was going to attend that party. I was going to wear the restrictive cream gold silk dress Elaine had practically ordered me to wear. I was going to let him pour the expensive wine, let the violins play their swelling chords, and let Brooke smile her victorious, arrogant smile from table 4. I was going to walk right into the glittering, perfectly constructed center of his velvet trap, and then I was going to ensure that the entire elaborate stage he built collapsed directly on top of him. The laughter cascaded over the perfectly set tables. Grant stood under the warm amber spotlight, basking in the cruel, synchronized amusement of his audience. He looked so incredibly victorious. He fully expected me to shrink, to turn red, to become the pathetic punchline he desperately needed me to be. I stood absolutely still. I let the mocking sound echo off the vaulted ceilings and bounce against the crystal chandeliers. I waited until the laughter began to thin, then fracture, and finally die out completely. It took exactly 20 seconds for the wealthy crowd to realize I was not embarrassed. I was not breaking character. I was simply waiting for my turn to speak. "No," I said. My voice did not shake. It sliced through the lingering, awkward silence with the cold precision of a diamond cutter. "This is Mr. Owen Pike. He is the official representative for the secured creditor that just acquired the primary loan facility of Mercer House Events." The shift in the room was violent and instantaneous. The smug amusement vanished from the faces of the investors sitting in the front row. Owen stepped smoothly around me. He did not perform for the crowd. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed his open leather folder onto the edge of the stage, right at the tips of my husband's polished leather shoes. Mercer House Events is currently in breach of multiple financial covenants. Owen stated. His voice was a low, steady rumble, but in that breathless room, it sounded like a judge reading a final verdict. "We have documented evidence of severe capital misallocation and gross fiduciary negligence. Effective immediately, any major financial transactions, including the spousal consent forms and debt restructuring agreements intended to be signed this evening, are under formal review by the new lien holder. Arthur Vance, the lead venture capitalist who had funded Grant for the last 4 years, pushed his heavy chair back. The wooden legs screeched sharply against the marble floor. Arthur stood up, his face flushing a dangerous dark red. He ignored Grant entirely and looked directly at Owen. "What default status?" Arthur demanded, his booming voice cracking with sudden fury. He pointed a thick finger at the stage. "Grant, why in the absolute hell was the board not formally notified that our primary credit facility was sold to a distressed asset firm? You told us the cash flow was perfectly stable just 48 hours ago." Grant opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The effortless charm he relied on his entire life completely evaporated. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge in the dark. I turned my head slowly, locking my gaze onto table 4. Brooke was sitting rigidly in her seat, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her mouth. Perhaps Grant was simply too busy allocating $12,500 every single month to a phantom brand advisory role, I said, making sure my voice carried easily over the ambient jazz music that the band had abruptly stopped playing. Brooke's artificial, sun-kissed complexion seemed to drain away in a fraction of a second, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The women sitting at her table immediately physically leaned away from her, sensing the sudden, toxic shift in her social standing. Grant whipped his head toward Brooke. His expression twisted into a visceral, ugly mixture of genuine panic and defensive rage. He knew the seasoned investors in the room were instantly doing the math in their heads, calculating exactly how much of their invested capital had been burned to fund his mistress. Suddenly, the screech of another chair broke the tension. Elaine bolted out of her seat, her carefully cultivated, aristocratic grace shattering completely. "This is completely absurd," my mother-in-law shrieked. Her voice was shrill, echoing frantically across the ballroom. "Nina, you vindictive, hysterical woman. You are trying to destroy your husband's entire company just because you are jealous of a silly rumor." Owen turned his head slightly to look at Elaine. He did not blink. He did not show an ounce of intimidation. "Madam," Owen said, his tone as sterile and unforgiving as a surgical suite, "every single document in this folder has been rigorously audited and legally verified. The signatures have been traced, and the bank transfers have been authenticated. I am not here to participate in a domestic dispute. I am here in my official fiduciary capacity. My presence tonight is strictly to ensure that Mercer House Events does not continue to generate fraudulent liabilities under false pretenses in front of witnesses." Grant scrambled to salvage the wreckage. He grabbed the microphone from the microphone stand, his hands trembling so violently that the microphone produced a sharp, painful burst of audio feedback. "Please, everyone, please do not listen to this," Grant pleaded, projecting a sickeningly desperate, hollow laugh. The confident founder was gone. The man on the stage was just a cornered animal. "This is just a private marital issue. Nina is unwell. She is under a lot of stress, and she is lashing out because of personal problems between us. We can resolve this privately. I assure you, the business is 100% sound." I stepped closer to the edge of the stage. I looked up at the man I had spent a decade holding together. He looked incredibly small. "Do not flatter yourself, Grant," I said. I did not shout, but the absolute clarity of my words struck him like physical blows. "Your infidelity is not the reason I brought a forensic accountant to our 10th anniversary dinner. Who you sleep with on company time is your own pathetic business, but forging my digital signature on commercial loan extensions is my business. Secretly shifting your failing corporate debt onto my personal social security number is my business. Attempting to use our marriage as a deceptive financial instrument to defraud your backers and trap me in your bankruptcy." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the captivated, horrified crowd before locking back onto him. "That is not a marital issue. Grant, that is a federal crime." The party did not dissolve into chaotic screaming. There were no dramatic physical fights, no crying fits, and no further theatrical outbursts from the Mercer family. Instead, The extravagant ballroom descended into a suffocating, terrifying silence. It was the heavy, crushing quiet of total realization. All around the room, men and women in expensive formal wear began quietly sliding their chairs away from the tables. Cell phones illuminated the dim space like tiny, cold stars, as powerful people immediately began frantically texting their private legal counsel and wealth managers. Arthur Vance did not say another word. He simply threw his linen napkin onto his untouched plate, turned his back on the stage, and walked out the grand front doors. Others immediately followed his lead. Nobody looked at Grant with sympathy. Nobody offered him a reassuring smile or comforting pat on the shoulder. They looked at him the way one looks at a collapsing bridge or a burning building. In the span of 5 minutes, my husband ceased to be the charming, visionary star of Charlotte high society. He was standing alone on a brightly lit stage, surrounded by thousands of imported white orchids, exposed to the world as a massive, radioactive liability. And I just stood there, watching his empire turn to ash. The morning after the gala, the real war began. The public execution was over. But the structural demolition was just getting started. I did not wait for the adrenaline to fade. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, my attorney filed the divorce petition. Simultaneously, a swarm of process servers descended on Mercer House Events headquarters, delivering a massive, ironclad legal hold order. It was a digital preservation mandate that absolutely prohibited the destruction, alteration, or deletion of any company emails, electronic signature files, and specific ledgers related to the contested operating expenses. We locked down the crime scene before the smoke even cleared. Grant's reaction was swift and entirely predictable. He instantly slipped into the comfortable, well-worn skin of the victim. By noon, the damage control spin was echoing through our social circles. He began aggressively calling every mutual friend, vendor, and low-tier investor who had not yet blocked his number. His narrative was desperately polished. "Nina's just completely spiraling," Grant told a close friend of ours over the phone, unaware that the friend had immediately relayed the conversation to me. "She has this terrifying control obsession. She found out about some minor financial hurdles we were facing, and instead of supporting me like a partner, she hired some aggressive, older corporate hitman to humiliate me in front of our entire network. She is literally willing to destroy the livelihoods of 50 innocent employees just to punish me for working too hard." The Mercer women mobilized their own secondary offensive line. My phone battery drained continuously as Elaine and Tessa launched a relentless, coordinated campaign of psychological warfare. The voicemails alternated wildly between pathetic pleading and vicious, venomous threats. In one message, Elaine would sob heavily into the receiver. "Nina, please, I am begging you, do not destroy this family. Grant is a good man who made some reckless business choices, but he loves you. You are his anchor." 2 hours later, Tessa would text me, her words dripping with pure malice. "You are completely delusional if you think anyone in Charlotte is going to hire you or speak to you after this stunt. You are going to be known as the bitter, vindictive bitch who actively murdered her own husband's career out of sheer jealousy. Enjoy dying alone." I did not reply to a single message. I simply forwarded every voicemail and every text directly to my legal team to add to the mounting pile of harassment documentation. The most significant breakthrough in the entire legal siege arrived completely unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my lawyer's sterile conference room when the receptionist buzzed in. A man named Devin Reese had walked into the lobby, unannounced, and explicitly asked to speak with me. Devin was the senior financial controller for Mercer House Events. He was a quiet, meticulous man who had worked for Grant for 6 years, silently holding the chaotic back office together with duct tape and sheer willpower. I knew Devin well. He was one of the few employees who genuinely understood the immense foundational work I had done during the company's early years. He walked into the conference room looking exhausted and deeply terrified. Without saying a word, he reached into his worn messenger bag, pulled out a heavy, encrypted external hard drive, and slid it across the polished mahogany table. "I am not going to let him pin this on the junior accounting staff," Devin said, his voice shaking slightly. He spent the entire morning trying to draft a retroactive memo blaming an entry-level clerk for the forged credit extensions. He was preparing to fire a 22-year-old kid to cover his own tracks. I cannot sleep at night knowing he is going to ruin innocent people. The hard drive Devin provided was the holy grail. It contained a complete, unadulterated mirror of the company server, captured just hours before the legal hold was officially served. When Owen and my attorney cracked the encryption and began sorting the data, they found the exact smoking gun communications we needed to bury Grant permanently. There was an email chain between Grant and a senior loan officer, explicitly discussing the forged signature. But the most damning piece of evidence was a direct, internal message Grant sent to Devin 2 months prior, specifically instructing him on how to handle the loan addendum. Make absolutely sure you do not send Nina the clean copy of the final restructure terms, Grant had typed, the digital timestamp forever freezing his guilt. She reads the fine print too closely. Just attach the signature token to the summary page and push it through the legal portal. I will handle her on my end. But Devin's data dump revealed something far darker and more disturbing than simple financial fraud. We uncovered a draft of a press release Grant had written and saved in a hidden folder, intended to be published the morning after the anniversary gala. The press release was a masterpiece of gaslighting. It formally announced that due to severe, ongoing mental health struggles, his beloved wife, Nina, was taking an indefinite, medically advised leave of absence from all professional and public duties. He was not just planning to steal my financial identity, he was planning to legally and socially erase my sanity. By establishing a public narrative that I was mentally unstable, he was building an ironclad defense against any future claims I might make regarding the forged documents. If I tried to fight the massive debt later, he would simply point to the press release and tell the judge that I was unwell, confused, and had completely forgotten signing the papers. He was preparing to bury me alive under a mountain of paperwork and fake medical concern, while the Mercer family scrambled frantically to extinguish the raging inferno I had started. The other key player quietly slipped out the back door. Brooke Halden executed a flawless, tactical retreat from the public eye. Within 24 hours of the gala, she had completely scrubbed her entire social media presence, deleting hundreds of photos and locking down every account. She vanished from the Charlotte social scene like a ghost. But behind the scenes, Devin's server logs showed she was still actively texting Grant on his private number. She was not offering emotional support or standing by her man in his darkest hour. She was aggressively demanding the immediate transfer of the security deposit for the luxury penthouse they had leased, along with her final fraudulent brand advisory payment. She treated his total public ruin as a minor, irritating logistical hurdle in her own lifestyle maintenance. As the legal machinery slowly ground Grant into dust, I began the grueling, exhausting process of rebuilding the architecture of my own life. I packed 3 suitcases, left the massive, suffocating house, and signed a short-term lease on a small, unassuming townhouse on the outskirts of the city. I set up a modest home office in the spare bedroom and transitioned entirely to remote work. The professional fallout Tessa had so gleefully predicted never actually materialized. In the rigid, unforgiving world of corporate risk management, my ruthless, surgical dismantling of Mercer House events was viewed not as a hysterical emotional outburst, but as an incredibly impressive display of extreme competence. 2 of my former, highly demanding corporate clients immediately reached out to me directly, offering lucrative, independent consulting contracts specifically because they recognized the pure, unfiltered analytical skill I possessed. But I was not a machine. The absolute clarity of my revenge did not instantly heal the massive, bleeding wound in my chest. There is no mathematical formula to calculate the exact weight of a decade of betrayal. There were nights in that quiet little townhouse when the crushing reality of it all would hit me with the force of a physical blow. I would lie awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, my heart racing, phantom anxiety gripping my throat. I would instinctively reach across the bed, half expecting to find Grant sleeping soundly beside me, only to grasp empty air. I had to completely relearn how to exist in the silence, I had to learn how to cook dinner for one person without automatically factoring in his dietary preferences. I had to learn how to sit alone in my small kitchen and drink a glass of wine without bracing myself for the inevitable sound of his heavy footsteps coming down the hall, ready to casually dismiss my thoughts or tell me I was severely overreacting to whatever minor slight he had delivered that day. I had won the war, decisively and completely, but I still had to survive the devastating, quiet aftermath of the victory. Mercer House Events was officially placed under mandatory restructuring supervision by the end of the month. The financial bloodletting was swift and entirely unsentimental. 3 major corporate clients, representing nearly 40% of the projected annual revenue, formally invoked the morality and management stability clauses in their event contracts to freeze all future deposits. Nobody wanted their elite brand associated with a violently imploding, legally radioactive vendor. The glittering, luxurious facade of Grant's empire was rapidly stripped down to the rusted scaffolding. The absolute silence from his investors finally broke him. The arrogant, untouchable founder who had mocked me under the chandelier lights completely vanished. Instead, my phone began ringing with a very different version of my husband. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual polished cadence, sounding genuinely panicked and exhausted. "Nina," he pleaded during a Tuesday morning voicemail, his tone incredibly soft and conciliatory. "I know I am the villain here. I know I made some deeply flawed, terrible personal choices, but the company does not deserve to die because of a marital dispute. We built this together. Do not let 50 innocent people lose their jobs just to punish me." He was still trying to compartmentalize the betrayal. He still wanted to treat systemic financial fraud as a simple personal choice, as if forging legal documents to secure debt was on the exact same moral level as forgetting an anniversary. I did not return his calls. Instead, I poured another cup of black coffee, sat down at my modest kitchen table, and logged back into Owen's secure server to review the pending litigation files hovering around the company. I thought I had already seen the absolute worst of it. I thought the hidden apartment lease and the fake brand consultancy fees were the absolute bottom of the barrel. I was profoundly wrong. Buried deep under layers of deliberately mislabeled digital folders, I found an active, rapidly escalating civil claim. 18 months prior, during a massive outdoor music festival produced by Mercer House, a severe structural failure in the VIP staging area resulted in life-altering physical injuries for 3 attendees. The commercial insurance provider had discovered a critical loophole in Grant's rushed vendor compliance checks and was aggressively refusing to pay out the full liability coverage. The injured plaintiffs were now coming directly after the company for catastrophic financial damages. And there, sitting quietly in the draft folder, for the new, consolidated refinancing package that Grant had planned to present to me on the stage that night, was a highly specific indemnification clause. He was not just trying to get me to co-sign the operational debt to keep the lights on for another quarter. He had specifically structured the new loan to entirely absorb the legal liability of that staging disaster and pin it directly to my personal assets. If I had smiled for the cameras and signed that decorative leather folio to save face, I would not just be carrying his business debt. I would have been legally responsible for a multi-million-dollar, multi-year civil lawsuit. He was quite literally trying to bury me alive under a mountain of devastating legal ruin, so he could walk away from the wreckage completely clean. The realization of that sheer, unadulterated malice was still burning cold in my chest when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Elaine and Tessa standing on my small concrete porch. For the first time in 10 years, my mother-in-law was not wearing her impenetrable armor of polite condescension. She looked genuinely haggard. Her posture was slumped, and the aristocratic air she usually carried had completely deflated. She stepped into my modest living room, looked around at the simple furniture, and her eyes welled with actual tears. "I knew things were tight at the office," Elaine confessed, her voice trembling slightly, entirely abandoning her superior tone. "But I swear to you, Nina, I had absolutely no idea how deep the hole was. I did not know about the forged signatures or the extent of the loans. Please, you have to stop this aggressive restructuring. We will lose everything. You have to call your accountant off. At the end of the day, no matter what Grant did, you are still family. I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The emotional detachment was complete and absolute. I am family when you need my signature, I replied, my voice perfectly level, dropping the words like heavy stones into a quiet room. When I need the truth, I am an obstacle. Tessa, who had been nervously chewing on her thumbnail by the doorway, suddenly snapped. The sheer terror of losing her luxurious lifestyle completely eroded whatever social filter she possessed. "We never thought you would actually do something like this," Tessa blurted out, her voice shrill and dripping with panic. "You have always been so quiet. We all thought you would never actually leave him, no matter what happened, because you live more for duty than you do for your own self-respect." The room went completely silent. Tessa instantly clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening as she realized exactly what she had just admitted out loud. But it was far too late. In one panicked, breathless moment, she had summarized exactly how the entire Mercer family had viewed me for a decade. I was just a workhorse. I was a reliable, dull appliance. They fundamentally believed I was too pathetic, too unremarkable, and too bound by obligation to ever defend my own dignity. I walked over to the front door, pulled it wide open, and waited for them to leave. They walked out into the afternoon sun without saying another word. The poetic justice of the following week was almost too perfect to believe. Brooke Halden, the woman who had smirked at me while casually drinking my husband's favorite bourbon, finally made her dramatic exit. However, she did not leave because of some sudden moral awakening or a heavy conscience over destroying a marriage. She left because she realized the money was completely gone. Devon confirmed through the frozen server logs that Brooke had tried to officially sign the lease for the luxury penthouse under her own name, fully expecting the company to immediately wire the funds. When the property management firm informed her that the Mercer House accounts were entirely frozen by a distressed asset firm and the massive security deposit had bounced, her grand illusion shattered. She realized Grant had lied to her just as effortlessly as he had lied to me. He had promised her an empire, a glamorous high society life, and endless corporate funding, when in reality, he was a broke, desperate man operating a rapidly sinking ship. She packed her designer bags, blocked his number across all platforms, and moved to Miami 3 days later. Grant lost the exact person he actually thought would stand beside him when the stage lights finally went out. At the very end of the month, my secure inbox chimed with a new message. It was a direct email from Grant. There were no manipulative subject lines, no flowery language about our long history, and absolutely zero pathetic excuses. It was a short, brutally defeated paragraph, requesting a private, one-on-one meeting at a neutral location. He explicitly stated he would come alone and bring his complete, unredacted personal files. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing screen for a long time. I knew the war was essentially over. I held the high ground, and his fortress was in ruins. But I also knew a man like Grant Mercer never completely empties his pockets unless he is absolutely forced to. I typed a brief reply confirming the date and time. I was not agreeing to meet him to offer some graceful forgiveness or to entertain the absurd idea of returning to him. I was going to sit across from him, look him dead in the eye, and find out exactly what other terrible things he had buried before the concrete fully set. The private, one-on-one meeting Grant requested never actually happened. Within 10 minutes of sitting down at the neutral coffee shop, it became abundantly clear that he was not looking for closure. He was looking for an angle. He spent the entire time trying to emotionally manipulate me into dropping the aggressive restructuring timeline. When I simply slid my empty coffee cup across the table and walked out, his panic finally curdled into desperate hostility. The very next week, we found ourselves sitting in a sterile, heavily air-conditioned mediation room under the glaring fluorescent lights of a downtown law firm, surrounded by extremely expensive attorneys. Grant arrived in a slightly wrinkled suit, projecting the exhausted, battered aura of a man who was simply trying to save his family legacy from a vicious, unprovoked attack. He had clearly rehearsed his narrative. For the first 2 hours of the arbitration, he sat across the long, polished oak table and systematically tried to rewrite the entire history of our marriage. He painted me as cold, painfully distant, and fundamentally unsupportive of his entrepreneurial dreams. When the mediator finally brought up the fraudulent loan applications and the forged digital signatures, Grant did not even blink. He leaned forward, adopting a tone of wounded sincerity. "It was a simple procedural oversight," Grant stated smoothly, looking directly at the mediator rather than at me. The back office was completely overwhelmed. A digital token was attached to the wrong PDF file by a junior clerk. Nina knows this, but she is intentionally escalating a minor administrative error because her motives are deeply compromised. He paused, letting a heavy theatrical sigh escape his lips. She has grown incredibly close to Mr. Owen Pike, abnormally close. She is using his firm to punish me for her own personal indiscretions. He was actually trying to play the affair card on the official record. He wanted to officially label me an adulterer, to invalidate my financial claims. Owen was sitting directly to my right. He did not look offended. He did not raise his voice to defend his honor. He simply reached into his perfectly organized leather briefcase and extracted a bound stack of paper. Owen did not deal in rumors. He dealt exclusively in server logs. What you are looking at is the complete metadata chain for the loan addendum in question. Owen told the room, his voice a low, mechanical rumble. He handed copies to the mediator and to Grant's lead counsel. It details the exact keystrokes, the system login credentials, and the precise timestamps. You will clearly see that the original, clean document was modified exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes after Nina was deliberately removed from the email thread. Furthermore, the IP address that authorized the final, forged digital signature belongs to the primary desktop computer located inside Grant Mercer's private office. Grant's jaw tightened, but before he could formulate another lie, the door to the conference room opened. Devin Reese walked in. Devin looked terrified, but he took his seat at the end of the table and swore his statement onto the official record. He looked Grant directly in the eyes and confirmed everything. He testified that Grant had explicitly ordered him to bypass the standard financial approval workflows. He stated that he was specifically instructed to clean up the documents, hide the toxic liability clauses, and prepare a sanitized version strictly to secure my physical signature at a later date. Grant tried to interrupt, loudly claiming Devin was a disgruntled employee facing termination, but my attorney simply raised a hand to silence him. "We have one final piece of evidence to submit," my attorney announced. She placed a small digital recorder in the absolute center of the table. "This is an internal voice note sent by Grant Mercer to his lead event manager at exactly 11 o'clock at night, the evening before the anniversary gala." She pressed the play button. The audio was slightly grainy, backed by the ambient noise of city traffic, but my husband's voice was unmistakably clear. He sounded arrogant, slightly drunk, and completely invincible. "Do not worry about the budget overruns on the floral arrangements," Grant's recorded voice echoed through the freezing mediation room. He let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Just put it on the company tab. Once I get Nina on that stage tomorrow night, and she signs that consensus paper in front of Vance and the board, the new credit line unlocks. She will be legally glued to the entire restructuring package. After that, she can cry all she wants. It will not matter." The click of the recorder turning off sounded like a gunshot. The entire room descended into a suffocating absolute silence. I watched Grant. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, gray shell. He stared at the small black device on the table as if it were a live grenade. His own lead defense attorney slowly closed his legal pad, carefully placed his pen down, and leaned away from his client. In that single, echoing moment, the grand illusion shattered completely. The polished, misunderstood entrepreneur evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, malicious fraud. The subsequent rulings were devastatingly swift. The arbitrator concluded there was overwhelming evidence of severe financial deception and deliberate fiduciary misconduct. I was completely shielded from every single toxic liability Grant had desperately attempted to graft onto my name. I secured a divorce settlement so heavily weighted in my favor that his attorneys barely bothered to contest it. I walked away with every single dollar of my premarital assets, including my private holding company, completely untouched and mathematically fortified. As for Mercer House events, I did not offer a single ounce of mercy. Through the secured debt structure I now legally controlled, I officially denied any further leniency. I authorized a ruthless, systematic restructuring. I forced the immediate liquidation of all valuable physical assets, from the imported stage lighting to the fleet of luxury transport vehicles. I stripped Grant of all executive control and voting rights. I ensured that the absolute first priority of the liquidation capital was allocated to pay the outstanding wages and severance packages for the 50 employees he had so recklessly endangered. Grant was left with nothing but a mountain of unsecured debt and a permanently ruined reputation in the only city he ever cared about. 1 year later, the air in Charlotte felt entirely different. I used the substantial profits from my independent consulting contracts, combined with the legal recoveries from the Mercer liquidation, to officially open my own boutique risk management firm. We specialized exclusively in contract auditing and liability protection for small, independent creative agencies. My new office was located in a quiet, sunlit building near the edge of the financial district. It was small, flawlessly clean, and completely devoid of any artificial, glossy corporate pretense. There were no massive crystal chandeliers, no velvet furniture, and absolutely no wedding photos on my desk. There was only one piece of decoration in the entire space. Hanging directly behind my chair was a small, understated brass plaque. It carried a very simple operational philosophy. It read, "Read before you sign. Listen before you trust." The final defining moment of my revenge did not take place in a courtroom, and it did not involve screaming at my ex-husband in a crowded restaurant. It happened on a quiet Friday evening in late October. I hosted a very small, private dinner at my new townhouse. There were no investors, no photographers, and no society influencers. I invited Marla Hensley, who brought an incredibly expensive bottle of red wine. I invited Owen Pike, who actually smiled twice during the appetizer course. I invited Devin Reese, who was now working comfortably as the lead financial director for a highly stable logistics firm. We sat around my dining table, eating good food, drinking rich wine, and talking about the future. We did not mention Grant. We did not discuss the ashes of his empire or the spectacular nature of his fall. He was simply gone, erased from the narrative entirely. I realized then that true, absolute victory is not about standing over your defeated enemy and demanding an apology they will never genuinely mean. It is about permanently removing their ability to write your story. Grant Mercer spent 10 years trying to turn me into a silent, useful shadow. But as I raised my glass to toast the people who actually stood by me when the lights went out, I knew the absolute truth. He lost everything. But I was the only one who walked out of the fire, keeping my name entirely clean. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below with your city or country, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so that this story can reach and be heard by many more people around the world.